Now, after doing all of this research, I did find that certain themes emerged, and that's what I'm going to concentrate this paper on today, talking about the things that came up in my research that influenced whether a person ended up as identifying as a Métis person or not. Because as you know, that first generation of mixed-race children, they were what we might call proto-Métis. They weren't Métis yet. They could go in different directions. They could either be reabsorbed culturally into a native band and become culturally Indian, or they could get socialized as Europeans, or they could possibly be Métis and become that big M Métis, a person who identifies with a specific historical group in Western Canada. So how does that whole thing start? Well, these are the themes I've identified, and I'm going to deal with them briefly and offer some suggestions. These are the themes which keep on coming in. First of all, the presence or absence of Euro-Canadian, European males in socializing children. That's one of them, and I'll deal with that in a minute. The initial goals, the economic goals that these outsider males had in coming to the fur trade company in the first place. It makes a difference, and I'll explain that. Epidemic disease. You'll say, what does that have to do with being Métis? You'll wait, and I'll tell you. Serial marriage practices. Oh, this is a real fun one. Anybody who's done Métis genealogy knows it's really wild, especially in the first generations. It's pretty wild. The introduction of Christian beliefs actually has an effect, and not the way you might expect. And again, economic conditions in Lower Canada. You think, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it does. But these are indirect things that I'm talking about, but they do have an effect. First of all, as John Foster and Jennifer Brown and others have pointed out, it's really key to socialization whether the white father hangs around or not, because they play a key part in socializing children. And one of the things that is related to this is one of the reasons that there are French Métis is because the Canadiens engagés and freemen who formed country marriages with Aboriginal women, they stuck around. Why did they stick around? The Canadiens that you hear about who become freemen in the upper country, who don't go back to Quebec, are different from the average contract employee, the pork eaters that you've heard about. The pork eaters are on small contracts. They're going to Grand Portage and they're going home. They're only there temporarily. However, the people who are signing 3-year contracts going into the Athabasca area from Montreal, they are there for the long term, much longer. Why? First of all, those people come from families where the fur trade is a way of life. It's not something that they do for temporary money like a summer job. I mean, everybody in Quebec at that time knew how to handle canoe and snowshoes and they could get around. But the people who are signing longer contracts are people who are in the business. Their families are in the business. The Montreal Fur Trade is a family-centered enterprise. It's comprised of military officers, government officials, merchants, outfitters, and they all marry each other. An outfitter will marry the daughter of another outfitter, that kind of thing. And they hire their relatives to man canoes. It's all very closely linked by kinship. There are a few different occupational classes in the Montreal Fur Trade you should know about. And you should know about them because these are your ancestors. They are importers and wholesale merchants. Some of them are involved in retail selling or fur trading. Outfitters. The outfitters are responsible for hiring engagés. They're responsible for servicing the inland posts with goods. They are in partnership amongst themselves or with wholesalers. Independent traders, also known as négociants, they conduct their own trading. Merchant artisans who retail their products to traders, and moneylenders. Now, as I mentioned before, these people tend to marry amongst themselves. Now, even though the British took over the fur trade elite in Quebec after the conquest, there was still room to move for Canadian outfitters and traders. Those people continue to participate in the Montreal-based fur trade. They are getting the financial backing of wealthy Canadians who have connections and money, and it's those individuals who move west to winter in the West, and it's those people who are establishing the kin relations with native bands, because they're the ones that are staying there long enough to do that. And several men that we know of as being the patriarchs of Métis families in the West fit this this occupational profile that I've laid out for you. The men from families of Montreal merchants, outfitters, négociants, and their relatives are the men who become freemen in the upper country. For example, Joseph Cardinal and Joseph Desjardins. They're two Canadian freemen who are basically the patriarchs of the Métis population in northeastern Alberta. They're a case in point. Joseph Cardinal and several other members of the Cardinal family were members of a Montreal-based family of outfitters. And their commercial activities in the fur trade date back to the 1680s. And some branches of this family end up in Detroit and in the French settlements of Louisiana, French regime Louisiana, when I'm using the term. And Joseph and his relatives Jacques, Jérémie, and Joachim were among the earliest Canadian engagés identified in the Athabasca fur trade of the 1780s. And they were all over the place. You'll find them from the lakes of northern Manitoba right up to the foothills of the Rockies. And they intermarried with native women early on, and you will find that there are cardinals who were the patriarchs of what are now reserve communities. There are lots of cardinals in Métis communities, and they're all through the United States as well. The Desjardins. Joseph Desjardins enters the fur trade as an independent trader in 1785, and he gets the financial backing of a fellow named Luc de la Corne, who is an influential military officer, a merchant, a diplomat. And although the Desjardins were primarily an agricultural family, they had really strong military connections. They had connections to the principal military families involved in the fur trade since the beginning of the French regime. The family patriarch of that family, Jean-Jacques Desjardins, was a soldier in the Carignan-Salière Regiment, which was brought over in 1665 to defeat the Iroquois. And Desjardins' daughters married veterans from those regiments, regimental companies. And later on, when these men participate in the French regime fur trade, and their sons participate in the fur trade, they hire their cousins as engagés. And this was very common. You'd go back and you'd hire your cousins to man the boats if you were in the position to hire people. Now, Joseph Desjardins was one of only a handful of French Canadians who get a trading pass the year he goes into the interior. The rest of them were Scots. And why was he able to establish himself permanently there? You have to understand, during this period, it was pretty hairy. Rival companies would lie in wait and beat people up as they were going to portages, and it was pretty cutthroat. This was the time Peter Pond was operating in Athabasca, and he was a bit of a psycho. I mean, he made life miserable for a lot of people. So how does Joseph Desjardins manage to survive? Well, what happens is he has a friend, Toussaint Lesieur, who is Peter Pond's clerk at Lac La Ronge, and he's also a tough guy. However, he is a tough guy who is related to Joseph Desjardins, which probably helps Joseph because it means that he's allowed to operate in that area, and he probably gets a little help from his relative. His brother, Joseph Desjardins' brother Antoine, comes in later, and he engages with another company. Finally, a third relative, Francois, comes out in 1792 with McTavish Frobisher. And later on, all three of these men are living as freemen. They do their 3-year thing, and then they're out of there. Now, Joseph Cardinal's daughter, Josephine, has 14 children. 4 by her first husband, who is the Canadian engagé turned freeman Joseph Ladouceur. 10 by her second country husband, Joseph Desjardins Jr., the son of Joseph Desjardins, that man I told you from Quebec who gets a servant's contract. Now, other children from these families intermarry with the Decoins, Francois Decoin's family, who is a Northwest Company clerk descended from the Decoin trading family, another trader who comes from these families. These children, in turn, intermarry with other people in the area around Lac La Biche, Alberta. They begin a tradition of intermarriage that is so pronounced that by 1880, most of the 300 Métis people who make up the population of Lac La Biche, Alberta, can trace their ancestry back to Joseph Cardinal and Joseph Desjardins. And this kind of thing is going on throughout the West. For example, in the Red River region of Manitoba, there are other Canadian independents who have established themselves. Charles Racette, Canadian freeman in the Red River area, had established trade and kin relations with the Saulteaux as early as 1780. Racette himself was descended from a family involved in the government fur trade at Tadoussac during the French regime. Antoine Pelletier d'Assiniboine, who is really one of the first XY people and freemen at Pembina, is descended from the Pelletier d'Antaya family, which was very active in the Iroquois fur trade right from the French regime. Now, you have to say to yourself, why are these people getting involved in the fur trade? Why are they working for companies like McTavish Frobisher? They're French. They're never going to get ahead. Well, the point is the French Canadian fur traders never saw British dominance as being a permanent condition. They always thought that eventually they would get the upper hand. First of all, at the same time that the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company were operating prior to 1821, there was a very strong St. Louis-based fur trade network, and it was run by French people. And those French people, Canadiens, Creoles, whatever you want to call them, had family connections in Montreal. And in fact, they had cousins who were down operating out of St. Louis, Missouri. If you look at the list, the servants list from the English River book that Harry Duckworth pulled together, Harry mentions a few names that he can't find them in the Quebec records. Well, I'll tell you why, because they're St. Louis records. Those are St. Louis people. They're coming up. And Peter Pond was down in St. Louis, too. We really are just beginning to scratch the surface to understand how these people operated, and they covered huge geographical areas. The other thing about the French is the Canadians had an affinity for wintering. The British never particularly cared for it. They didn't like living out in tents in the winter away from the post. Unfortunately, if you want to develop kin relations with native groups, if you want to learn about how to trade furs, if you want to learn the wilderness or bush skills that you need, you've got to go out there and live, and you've got to live for a sustained period of time. What eventually happened is that the fur trade prior to 1821 was being run on the ground by engagés and freemen who could speak Aboriginal languages, had the kin connections, and basically their British bosses are kind of waiting and wringing their hands and hoping that everything will work out. And the other thing that happens as a result of this is these men who have established these family relationships, who have done the lengthy, what we might call bride service to get involved with an Aboriginal community, they're staying with their children. And in some literature, you'll find these men referred to in a very negative fashion. And that's because of who's writing the accounts of these men. The fact is quite often you'll find freemen referred to in very negative ways by British writers, and it's because the people who are writing these accounts couldn't control them. The freemen were very powerful within their own milieu. They did what they wanted. They did as they saw fit. And in fact, after 1821, when Sir George Simpson realizes he's got to get a handle on these people, he does it the crude, inelegant way by threatening to send them back to Quebec and cutting off their ammunition. That's how he does it. That's how he basically gets those people in line. It's the only leverage he has is his monopoly, because he can't do it any other way. These Canadians were devoted to their families because within Quebec, the fur trade, the military, and the religious complex were all integrated and centrally controlled. It was the custom during the French regime to establish an outpost. You'd have a priest and you'd have your military officers at the same time, and gradually over time, it was the practice in Quebec for people to come down and settle in these little settlements. And gradually they become, I guess, little carbon copies of the communities on the St. Lawrence. So what you have happening in this part of the world is you will have voyageurs and freemen going back to Quebec, bringing their little babies back with them in the canoes to get baptized at their home parishes in Quebec. And the late Mr. Fortier, who used to work at the St. Boniface Historical Society, at one time was compiling a list of the baptisms of all these little babies that were going back in the canoes to get baptized. Because the way these freemen saw it, their children were part of their home community in Quebec. And many of these men fully intended to go back and retire and settle down there. So these families were part of that larger community. It was usually the intention of a lot of the British Canadian traders to leave families behind. And what happened then is that eventually those women and children would be protected by Canadian or Métis men regardless of their ethnic origins. And they would be socialized within a Canadian Métis milieu, because that, if they were laborers, they weren't moving up in the Hudson's Bay Company to managerial status. So they were working in a Canadian Métis work environment. Now, just because you have the birth of small M Métis children doesn't mean they immediately transform into big M Métis with a national identity and collective concerns. Other things have to happen. As I mentioned before, I mentioned epidemic disease, marital practices, Christianity, and economic conditions in Lower Canada. I'd like to talk about these now. Epidemics. Between 1780 and 1783, there is a devastating smallpox epidemic that goes through Rupert's Land. At that time, this epidemic is believed to have wiped out between half and three-quarters of the Ojibwa populations living west and north of Grand Portage. Now, it also wiped out a lot of Cree people as well, and in a final version of this paper, I'm going to get those statistics as well. Now, you would say, well, yeah, so? Well, the fact is this particular epidemic occurs at a very crucial time. It occurs after the 7 Years' War is ended, and it occurs after the American Revolution is over, and people are going back into the fur trade. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company are sleeping by the frozen sea, waiting for their Cree and Assiniboine middlemen to bring in furs. And the Cree and Assiniboine middlemen have access to trade goods. They don't need to develop any kin relations with European men. However, if the Canadians, the French, want to get into the fur trade and compete, they have to establish a wintering relationship with somebody. So if the Cree doesn't want them, and the Assiniboine don't want them, and the Blackfoot later on are just not particularly interested in going and trading beaver, how do you do this? Well, as it turns out, the Ojibwa bands, after this particular smallpox epidemic, are devastated. Now, what that allows it allows the incorporation of outsiders. You start to have shortages of young adult males because they've been killed by smallpox. It makes it easier for Ojibwa bands to accept outsiders that they once might have spurned. You have to understand that when a young Canadian engagé comes out there, he can paddle a canoe, he can use snowshoes, he can probably hunt a little bit, but there's a lot of skills he doesn't have. He doesn't have his language skills down. He doesn't know how to fight. He doesn't know the territory. He doesn't know all that stuff. He has to learn it. He's going to be dead weight for a while. He's going to be really useless for a while, and they're going to have to whip him into shape. So why would they accept somebody who could be a drag on the whole group? But they will, because he has access to trade goods. They've got a lot of men who've died from smallpox. They need hunters. They need warriors. They need husbands and fathers. So they will take in these guys when they might not have before. Same with some of the Cree bands later on, especially later on when the Hudson's Bay Company is not allowing Cree and Assiniboine middlemen to control everything. The other thing about white guys coming in was that they were outsiders. In Ojibwa society, as you know, they have a kinship system, and it's based on your membership in patrilineal clans. And the great thing about marrying off a Canadian male to an Ojibwa woman is there was no violation of kinship taboos. He was an outsider. They weren't going to be doing anything incorrect, so he was an acceptable mate. So that helped. And in the 1770s and 1780s, the first of these independent traders make their way from Montreal and begin to establish relations with Native groups. Many of these men formed country marriages with Ojibwa women, and a lot of these particular marriages became the nucleus of Métis communities out here. Next thing about I'll talk about serial marriages. Now, a lot of us have been quoting R.K. Thomas's essay in the New Peoples, which is a really great essay. One of the things he talks about is what has come up before about markers, cultural markers. And he says, quote, "The first has to do with the content, the what of the we, that which anthropologists generally call culture. The second concerns a more abstract dimension of collective identity, the question of nationality, that sense of common origin and common destiny felt even by strangers who live many miles apart." Now, how do the Métis people, who are scattered over thousands of miles in hundreds of communities, retain that sense of common origin and destiny that's so essential to nationhood without having that sovereign territory, which is also considered a hallmark of nationhood? Well, first of all, I would say that the reality, rather than merely the sense of common origin, has a great deal to do with it. It is not uncommon for modern Métis people to find distant blood relatives in almost any Western Canadian community with fur trade origins, be they Indian or non-Indian. I'm related to at least 3 of the other conference presenters here by blood. Now, Métis people take that for granted, but it is not common. If you go to other conferences, chances are you're not going to be related to people there. But this is really common in the Métis community. I've gone into libraries where I've sat down in Manitoba, and the guy next to me said, "Well, what are you researching?" And I give a family name. "Oh, they're our grandparents too." "Oh, yeah, so we're related to those." This is really, really common. And as somebody said, we're all related. Well, don't denigrate that. That blood is thicker than water. There's a reason people say that. And it's a really important component of feeling that sort of mano a mano feeling you feel with other Métis. It's important. It is important, I believe that. We are all related. And we can thank our ancestors' marital practices for that. Now, as I mentioned, the French and the Scots, who by and large were the progenitors of large Métis communities, they believed in family unity. They believed in family endeavors. They were really clannish people. They were a lot like Aboriginal people. I always have the sense that the Scots, some of the Highlanders, knew exactly where Native groups were coming from because they were like that themselves. And they married amongst themselves. Business and family life was all the same. You hired your relatives. You married your female cousins if you were allowed to by the church. But once these traders get into the upper country, they start combining their own Euro-Canadian marital practices with the Aboriginal ones. And they did things like arrange to have protectors for their families if they were going home on furlough for any reason. And that meant that they also assumed that that person would be the husband and father while they were gone. And I've studied the genealogical records of a lot of freemen, and I've also been in communication with many people who do genealogy on their families. And the earlier you go back, or the farther you go back into the very roots of these communities, the more complex it becomes. We realized that they had really flexible, maybe even liberal ideas about marriage. We know that freemen sometimes had 2 wives at the same time, or they married sisters, which was an Aboriginal practice. Some of our records suggest that some freemen would end one country union, take up another relationship with another woman, then go back to the original woman. We know this because we could track the births through scrip affidavits. We also know that sometimes a hunter would break off relations with one woman, and then we discover that his pal, his hunting companion, takes the same woman as a wife later on. And we know this because we can read the fur trade records, post records that refer to groups of hunters, and we can look at scrip affidavits as well. And sometimes there's also a case that John Foster cites of the freeman Jean Dumont. He turns off his Sarcee Crow wife. He gives her to another freeman, Paul Durand, to take as his wife. He goes to Lower Canada. He changes his mind, and he comes back 2 or 3 years later, and he asks for her back. Well, Durand doesn't want to give her back, so basically he takes her back forcibly, is what they say. So I guess probably John Durand underwent a hell of a beating. Anyway, Durand disappears from the records, and Dumont carries on with his wife. So these kinds of things happened. And then things get really complicated. You get situations where you have several brothers and cousins who have joined up as engagés. They do their 3-year hitch, and then when it's over and they become freemen, they all move from various places in Rupert's Land and join up together in one spot. And the Desjardins family does this. They sign up in different posts, but after a while they all seem to glom on together at places like Lac La Biche. They end up at Red River. They're all in one spot. Another place that's really interesting is at Pembina, where you end up with all these engagés and freemen, and they're all descended from an extended family network that was originally founded by Paul Huss, or Huet, in the parish of Sorel. The Peltiers, Aubuchons, Miette de Beauchemins, the Mainvilles, or known as Mandeville down there, the Azures, the Tessiers, the Duvals, the Lavallées, the Pauls, they were all related in Quebec before they even came out to Rupert's Land. They were all related back there. So when they get here, what they're doing is they're doing their thing, they have their country wives, then they all seem to migrate down to Pembina, where they then start intermarrying again. Now what you get out of all of this is you've got people, Métis people, who are related to one another by blood through their mother's line and their father's line. They are also getting really tight unions because you've got multiple unions with, you know, the freeman, he's got 3 wives. They all have children. They're marrying other freemen. Then there's another generation and they're all intermarrying. And I can only say that it really got tough for the priests because, of course, they have to find out if people are allowed to marry to make sure they're not breaking the consanguinity laws. And it's just a headache. They're literally tearing their hair out. It's quite funny to read this stuff, actually. And that brings us to religious influences. How am I doing? Okay. So you have to understand that the fur traders of all the companies originally discouraged the church from coming out. For one thing, they didn't want an alternative authority to their own out there. And really, Christianity is incompatible with fur trading. Christianity implies not working on Sundays, staying in one spot to grow crops, which of course scares away wild animals, etc., etc., etc. In any case, eventually you do get ministers because of things like Seven Oaks. The liquor traffic had escalated to such an extent that the violence also escalated, and things had gotten pretty bad down on the ground. There was way too much liquor abuse. There was way too much violence in families and between groups. Something had to be done. So reluctantly, both companies permit priests to come out. The problem is the priests and the ministers were only partially successful in their goals. First of all, the priests couldn't, they were asked to Christianize native people, but they couldn't speak native languages. This is a problem. So they end up concentrating their efforts on Canadians and their Métis children who understand French and also have a little bit of prior exposure to Christianity. Now, what happens as a result of that is that the Métis get all of the attention from the priests. Even when Father Belcourt arrives to Pembina, he's a gifted Soto-linguist, and he is quite capable of converting native people to Christianity, but he is not interested in going out to native communities. He believes that Christianization and settlement are the way to go. He believes that you must have a settled community. So what happens is when Belcourt sets up his mission at Bay St. Paul, what happens is that the Métis people there are staying put. They're still going out for their semi-annual buffalo hunts, but they're part of a parish community. Native people, Soto, are still getting Christianized, they're getting baptized, but they're marrying into that community and they're becoming part of that Métis community. In this case, you've got Indians, Soto, who are being absorbed into the Métis community there. Now, what is the effect of establishing these missions is that it serves as a locus for the development of Métis communities that are separate and distinct from all the Plains Indian bands outside that are going on seasonal rounds. You have a permanent agricultural settlement with a mission at its heart. It encourages the Métis people that are connected to those places to choose Christian mates from their own communities, or they choose Christianized Indian people. Even those Métis who only do a little bit of agriculture and spend most of their time hunting still view those parishes as their permanent home. However, this does not happen in Athabasca, in the boreal forest and parkland areas of northern Alberta and northern Saskatchewan. First of all, one of the things that you have happening is that there is a 25-year delay for priests to establish themselves, and Christian ministers to establish themselves in northern Alberta. 1818, you have the first churches at Red River. You don't get permanent missions in northern Alberta till the 1840s. That's quite a gap. The only thing you have are maybe elderly Canadian engagés teaching their children little Roman Catholic practices. The first priests you get in 1844, and the Protestants come in 1853. The other impediment to developing a Métis community as such in northern Alberta is an environmental thing. If you've ever been to East Central and Northern Alberta, it's a parkland boreal forest traditional zone. Everybody who lives outside Fort Edmonton is involved in the seasonal subsistent round. They're living in small family groups. They're moving around pursuing game. They have very fluid groups. They get smaller and bigger so that they can incorporate people to help, or if they don't have enough food to go around, they can send people away. What is happening is these groups are made up of people of mixed blood. There are also people who are completely Indian. These groups are intermarrying back and forth, and basically they're homogenous culturally, and they're an Aboriginal culture. It's not Métis. It's a mixture, and the ethnic thing is really blurred in this area to the point that when the Treaty 8 people come up, they just let people declare as Métis because some of them don't know if they have European ancestry. They literally do not know. Now, when the missionaries eventually do Christianize hunting bands in the area of Athabasca in northern Alberta, you don't have distinct and separate communities like Indian or Métis. That doesn't happen until later when you get treaties and reserves. The final thing I want to talk about here, and I'm sorry, I know I'm going over, so I really apologize. I'll get through this really fast. It was always the intention of engagés and freemen to eventually go home to Quebec with their native families. It was quite acceptable, and they just assumed they'd get sucked in and be part of the big family. However, what happens in Quebec is that by 1821, all of the land is gone. The river lots have been divided and subdivided to the point where there's no more left. Then the second thing that happens is young people have to leave, and then you get United Empire Loyalists and people from Britain coming over to live. And pretty soon all the land in Upper and Lower Canada is gone, plus you get an agricultural crisis. So there's nowhere to go. Even if they want to go home to Quebec, they can't. Because if they try to claim their land as eldest sons or whatever, it's going to put somebody else out in the family. So what happens is these freemen, they don't go back to Quebec. They don't go back, and their Métis children don't get absorbed and become Québécois or Canadiens. They stay back, they stay in Western Canada, and they hunt buffalo, they enjoy prosperity, and they stay Métis people. I could go on a lot here, but it's in the paper, but basically it's really, a lot of it's luck and circumstance, and I'll just sum up again. The presence or absence of European males in the socialization of children, keeping Métis children in Rupert's Land rather than removing them to culturally dominant Euro-Canadian communities back east, regulating Christian influence in forming families and mission communities as opposed to allowing people to live out in the bush, hunting and gathering versus semi-permanent agriculture, and not being able to go back. That's what I found has affected the growth of Métis communities. Thank